Andreas?
Yes, just a word about the difference between the church in the East and the West. As you know, in the Orthodox churches, the Eastern churches admit divorce and remarriage on the ground of Matthew 19, which is a clause which speaks of adultery, but it does not speak of adultery. The Eastern Church understood it as such, but in fact, the word used is not moikeia, which means adultery, but porneia, which is something totally general and different. And it means probably consanguineous unions, which are not unions. And so in the Latin Church, it was never accepted, adultery was never accepted as a ground for divorce. There is no ground for divorce at all. Now, the other point which is very interesting is the notion of contract. In our canon law, we say that a marriage is a contract, a free contract between two free persons. But the difference with a civil contract is that the terms of the contract are fixed. You cannot decide what you put into the contract. And so, the contract is fixed by the order of creation, a given order. And so once a marriage is contracted and consumed, realized, then it is absolutely indissoluble.
Next question is by Monsignor Peter Schallenberg.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sir Vittorio, for your contribution. I have only a short question about Luther. Could you perhaps explain with some sentences why Martin Luther was so strictly against the marriage as sacrament? Also in the Catholic tradition before Lateran Council of 1215, it was a little bit discussed but then confirmed. Why Luther was so strictly against marriage in a social form and not as a sacrament?
Yeah, I mean, the central idea of Luther is that there are only two sacraments, communion and baptism. He once says the ultimate sacrament could be penance. Yeah, but he wants to reduce the number of sacraments because he thinks that they are not the sacraments have to be installed by Christ himself. And since the marriage antedates Christ, while the communion was installed by Christ himself and the baptism was performed on Christ, they should not be called sacraments. I mean, before the Peter Lombard, the Catholic Church did not distinguish between what we call today sacrament and sacramentalia. So you can find lists in the 11th century of 30 sacraments. Sacramentum means anything that is a symbol of a connection to the divine. And the reduction of the sacraments to the number 7 is something that occurs only in the late 12th century and is then accepted after these theological discussions in the Fourth Lateran Council. And if you want, Luther continues the reductionist tendency by saying there are only two sacraments left. I mean, obviously, also Luther is committed to the importance of marriage, but it's a social estate. And this is also connected to the idea that for Luther, there is a strong dualism between this world and the divine order. While the Catholic understanding is, if you want, that the sacraments permeate the whole of reality. And by having this conception, you have simply more sacraments. Yeah? While in the Lutheran idea, you want to limit it. It's interesting that there is one famous Lutheran in the tradition who defended the presence of the sacraments in human life. Goethe, in Wahrheit, in Dichtung und Wahrheit, is, even if he was a Lutheran, saying the Catholic life is simply richer and closer to God through the fact that they have more sacraments than we Lutherans have. Yeah?
Yes, thank you for the paper, Vittorio. I like the way you started section 4 with German philosophy, and you give Humboldt first, and then Kant. And in fact, Humboldt was printed in the middle of the 19th century, but Kant and Goethe could have read the Thalia shorter publications. And obviously, Goethe is also interesting in this respect because the Wahlverwandtschaften is about family. My question is, you deal very finely with Humboldt. What is alive and what is dead in Humboldt, according to your judgment?
Well, thank you. Riccardo has translated the work by Humboldt into Italian, so he's a much better expert than I am about Humboldt's work. Humboldt did not publish his work, only an extract in which the reflections on marriage are contained in Vitalia, as you were rightly saying, because he later became more skeptical of his whole argument. And Humboldt's work is, in many aspects, a very problematic work because it anticipates radical libertarianism. Fundamentally, the idea is the state should withdraw as much as possible, and we should have individuals doing contracts. And in this context, he says also the marriage has to be completely subjected to the desire of the partners. So it's the opposite of what Archbishop Milnerad was telling us, that there is a contract, but that the form of the contract is given. He thinks it should be, and it's not clear why the contract should be limited to 2 persons. He doesn't say you could imagine also a contract between 3 or 4 persons. He doesn't say that, but insisting that the modification should be completely left to the will of the partners. You're asking yourself whether this would be a natural consequence. That I think is the problematic aspect of Humboldt. Humboldt continues also the tradition of romantic marriage. And this is something which is quite important. I mean, Vico, who was one of the first persons who understood how deeply humanity has changed in history, rightly says, when you analyze the Iliad, he was a good knower of the Homeric poems, one thing that you understand is there is no love in that book. You marry for 3 reasons. Patrimonial reasons, for having children, and because your social standing will be increased. Never Menelaus shows some romantic involvement with Helen, but it's an insult that his wife has been taken away. And all this comes in, and Humboldt is influenced by a romantic idea and has the idea of a complementarity of the sexes. Like Schiller in the famous poem, The Glocke. And so he wants to have some form of complementarity between man and woman. Of course, Humboldt comes from an enormously wealthy background. He was a German aristocrat with a beautiful castle that is still in the possession of the family. He didn't understand the necessity of stable institutions, for example, for the working class, how important it is for persons who don't have their castles to have the possibility of relying on things. And Goethe's attitude to marriage is complex because on the Goethe himself once a little bit ironically said, I don't understand why people call me not Christian enough. I have had Gretchen, who killed her child, executed in the Faust, and Ottilie, who commits the first step to adultery. She only kisses the married man, starve herself to death. What do people want more from me? That is a famous sentence. Was wollen die guten Leute mehr von mir haben? Than that. And so he clearly is quite committed to the principle of the indissolubility of marriage.
Thank you. John?
Thank you for a very rich paper. I enjoyed learning from you about the philosophy and the way it works in terms of how each philosopher takes off each other ideas. And it's in that I want to raise the question of not just the relationship between the marriage partners, but how do children fit into this? And I think that's quite important because the paramountcy of children is the replication of the love of the parents, but also the complexity of childlike behavior with parents and the children they are responsible for. In other words, those responsibilities cannot be equal, but they have to be shared. And how does that fit into the, as you put it, the very well expressed view, the problem of the crisis of the nuclear family? It may be that you see it as the family unit, parents, but equally, isn't it the children that have come to the surface as being either the victims or not the beneficiaries of what that love should be?
The reason why family law is much more difficult than other areas of law is that emotions are involved. And there is no way how you can enforce emotions. You can enforce a payment. Yeah? And if you don't pay, then, how do you say in English, Gerichtsvollzieher, the person who knocks at your door and takes the property out that you owe to a person. But you cannot in the same way enforce affection to children. And therefore, we have an area that has to be left to customs, to traditional morals, to religion, and that the state must rely on, but simply cannot enforce. And what I found very interesting what was discussed this morning, whether we should not be stricter with the permission to marry. I mean, in traditional societies, you could only marry if you had certain economic possibilities. There was a marriage license that you should have, and that you should go through a catechumen, a state of marriage catechumen, in order to guarantee that people are mature for this responsibility. I think this is a very reasonable thing to consider. It's very difficult to test when the maturity is given, but I think it makes perfectly sense. And what is clear, this I think I stated in my paper, that children have rights. And that one of the reasons why I admire the Kantian theory is that Kant and Hegel are absolutely committed to the rights of the children. While Fichte fundamentally has the idea of the patria potestas of Roman law. As you know, the Roman father had the right to kill his children. When the child was born, if the father didn't like the child, he could smash it against the wall, and that was just fine. It was his property. Yeah? Fichte defends this idea. It's horrific that in the late 18th century, someone can have the idea. And the idea of the rights of the children is a relatively late idea. I teach at the University of Notre Dame, and as you probably know, at Notre Dame, there was MacIntyre, and there is this legend that if you're a good Catholic, you have to be an Aristotelian and be against Kant, which I always found silly. But I always say to these Catholics, look at the question of abortion. Aristotle in the Politics has no problem whatsoever with abortion. Kant in the Rechtslehre explicitly says the rights of a child begin with conception. So in this question, it's Kant and not Aristotle that gives us a foundation. And certainly we must assume that the children have rights toward their parents, and the state usually is better advised not to step too much in the family, but if the rights of the children are violated by violence or sexual abuse, the state has a duty to step in and save these children because they're not property of their parents. Yeah? So this seems to me the basic principle of the rights of the children. Yeah? And this entails duties of the parents.
So, yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation and also for the inspirations that you gave us. As to the rights of the children, this is very crucial point because you said that in the past the children were like the property. I don't know if it is correct to say that the children were like the property. Maybe we can say that the children, sorry, I don't want to be provocative, but as jurists, I say that the children, they do not have the rights. They don't have rights for one reason, because they cannot exercise the right. The adults, so the family, as the families have the responsibility vis-à-vis the children, because if you speak about the right of the children, somebody can judge also the family. And this is a very tricky point because, for example, in Sweden, in Norway, they used to say the family is poor, the children have the right to live in a rich family, and so they can take away the children from the family. So I think that as a word, I know that we agree on the substantial. I speak as a lawyer now, okay, not as a philosopher, and it's a different point. But if we see that the children have the rights, it means that somebody must exercise the rights of the children, and the children become the object of the right of somebody. So, as to me, the best word, I'm just speaking about that, not about the meaning of your speech, because I agree. But maybe the better word is responsibility. As this morning Cardinal Parolin said, is a munus. So the family is the community, the first community who has the munus, the responsibility to take care of the children. And so I think in a juridical point of view, we have just to speak about the responsibility vis-à-vis the children. Thank you.
Just a second. I'm afraid we are out of time. Professor Schlitz also have a question for you. I suggest that she puts her question, and then in the general discussion, you answer both. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this paper very much, but I have one question about the treatment of Mary Wollstonecraft's work in the paper, especially I know that it's just a brief summary and there's so much more in there that you weren't allowed to talk about, but the message is very clear in your paper that Wollstonecraft, to quote it, argues that there's only one standard of virtue, and her ultimate aim is to enable women to come as close as possible to the virtues traditionally associated with men. There's a book that was published from Notre Dame Press in 2021 called The Rights of Women Reclaiming a Lost Vision by Erica Bacciacci. And she extensively studies the work of Mary Wollstonecraft and uses it to ground a dissection of the trajectory of a lot of feminist thought. And part of her argument is that a big piece of what Wollstonecraft was also arguing was that this reciprocity of morals applies to men too. And she was asserting that actually men had to assume some of the moral reasoning capabilities of women, and that was especially tied to things having to do with family and care of family. So I just I would like to know whether you agree with those aspects of Mary Wollstonecraft's arguments and how they might, if accepting that, how they might also support or be related to Robert Putnam's observations that the breakdown in family that we're seeing is largely a moral question. And then my view that women have a particular role to play in rectifying that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll recover these two last questions in the general discussion.